So welcome back, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're in the third session of the Building Relationships That Support Wildlife track, otherwise known as track 3. So welcome to track 3, welcome back. And this is the 29th annual ELA conference. My name is Julie Snell, and I serve on the ELA Board of Directors, and I'll be your host for today's third session. So once again, we really do encourage you to click on those cameras. We like to see those smiling faces. It's nice to have that eye contact, especially at the beginning. It's just nice to kind of foster that online learning community. So we're happy to see you. Give us a wave. There you go. Excellent. We're so happy to have Heather here today with us. Heather Holm is a biologist, a pollinator conservationist, an award-winning author. She passionately informs and educates audiences nationwide through her writing and many presentations about the fascinating world of native pollinators and beneficial insects and the native plant communities that support them. Heather is the author of 4 books: Pollinators of Native Plants from 2014, Bees 2017, Wasps in 2021, and Common Native Bees of Eastern United States 2022. Both bees and wasps have won multiple book awards, including the American Horticultural Society's Book Award in 2018 and 2022. Heather's expertise includes interactions between native pollinators and native plants, and the natural history and biology of native bees and predatory wasps. Her work is featured in the New York Times, the Minneapolis Star Tribune, and many other local publications. Heather is also an accomplished photographer, and her pollinator photos are frequently featured in print and electronic publications. Heather is a National Honorary Director of the Wild Ones, and she also serves on the board of the following nonprofits: Friends of Palaine Nature Preserve and Bird Sanctuary, Friends of Minnetonka Parks, and her local Wild Ones chapter, Prairie Edge. In her spare time, if she has any, she's an active community supporter, writing grants and coordinating and participating in volunteer ecological landscape restoration projects. Her latest project is a 13-acre oak savanna restoration that sounds very cool, that will provide thriving habitat for pollinators, birds, mammals, and passive nature-based opportunities for people. Please join me in welcoming Heather. Yay, Heather.
Thank you. Thank you, Julie. Great to be here. I will get my presentation up, and given that introduction, you'll probably be surprised to hear I'm not really talking about pollinators for this presentation. I actually put this presentation together based on a lot of my volunteer ecological restoration work. And if you just tuned into Deborah Lindau's talk previous to this one, I have a little bit of repeating information, but I hopefully just build a better foundation on this idea of what are fire-dependent systems. So I'm going to really be talking about the things that I have learned over the last 20 years restoring landscapes, and also some of the challenges. And at the beginning, some of those challenges were because I didn't understand the systems fully that I was working in. And until we really understand the ecological history of the land and also the profound influence of Native Americans and the role of fire, we really can't successfully restore land no matter where we live in the US. So I'm going to be starting off by looking into the past. I live in Minnesota, so I will have some Minnesota related examples, but thinking about how do we plan for climate change no matter where we live, whether it's in the Midwest or in the Northeast or wherever you may be participating from today for this presentation. And then I want to look into the future, because really, if we're restoring land or doing habitat or conservation gardening projects, we need to be thinking about resiliency. And are these landscapes that we're designing and planting going to withstand the future warming of the climate? And also the really rapid change in perhaps what we consider to be the normal plant communities that occur. So I want to dive into sort of a better understanding of this idea of a prairie to forest continuum. And prairies can also mean meadows if you're in the Northeast, but really these grassland and forest dominated systems. I also want to look at how these different plant communities have the capacity to sequester carbon, because that's one thing we hear is in order to combat climate change, we are told to plant trees. And that may not be a suitable recommendation depending on your specific goals. And then how do these systems really, how can we manage them and steward them and restore them so that we are sort of maximizing ecosystem functionality? So I'm going to talk about all of these things in addition to how all of this relates to oak ecosystems. So as I mentioned, I'm in Minnesota, smack dab in the upper Midwest. And you can see I've outlined the state of Minnesota on this level 2 ecoregion map. And our state has 3 primary biomes. We actually have 4, but this level 2 map is showing the 3 primary biomes. The middle green biome is largely deciduous forest that you are familiar with if you're in the Northeast. The beige area in the southwest part of our state is prairie and grassland. And then the light blue is more of a boreal ecosystem. So if we look at that from the standpoint of, okay, that's our existing conditions, what is going to happen with climate change? And the modeling is demonstrating where I live in the Twin Cities area, which is in that green, lower green section on the eastern side of the state. Our climate is projected to be the same as Manhattan, Kansas. So we are going to push into a hotter and drier type scenario. And so given that modeling, thinking about what sort of plant communities that still exist in my state today and how they may be equally as resilient going forward with this projected change in climate. And this is just a blow up of sort of the center section of the state that I live in, again, showing the 3 primary biomes, the boreal forest to the northeast that wraps around the north side of Lake Superior, that middle zone that is characterized as a deciduous woodland or forest, and then prairie pushing in from the west, from the southwest portion. This map is called the Marshner map, and it was generated by Francis Marshner, who was a cartographer. And basically, when the Midwest was laid out, I have lived in the East and I'm familiar with the non-grid system, really some of the primary roads being former cart paths. Here in the Midwest and much of the country, the land was surveyed into this grid system. And while surveyors were doing so, they were noting in their survey records specific bearing trees that were at the intersection of the certain size plots. And so these bearing trees were noted for species and size, and also there were often general descriptions of the environment or specific plant community that the surveyor was moving through. And so the map is called the Original Vegetation of Minnesota, and there are similar maps for other states. I would like to say original in quotes because it's, again, a certain point in time and it's representing what were the plant communities at the point of European settlement. So it is by no means an original vegetation map. But what's interesting is Francis Marshner, who was the cartographer, never actually even came to Minnesota. He was based in Washington, D.C., and he really just pored over the survey books, the surveyor books and records, and was able to create this complex map of plant communities by using that information. But these maps, of course, are very valuable. It gives us a glimpse at a certain point in time to understand the land and maybe some of the influences of Native Americans, but not entirely. And this tension zone that sort of sits in the middle of this warm, dry prairie system and cool, moist boreal forest has really shifted over time since the last glaciation. So when we had a period of warming and drier conditions, that prairie would push up into a more northerly part of our state. And then when we have a period of cool, moist conditions, that tension zone shifts. Now, I live within the tension zone in that brown area, or that kind of rusty red colored area. And that is primarily oak savanna. And we do have green within that tension zone, which would have been more closed canopy forest, but I'll talk a little bit more about the differences between the two. But with any plant community, not only is it influenced by amount of precipitation and evaporation, but also we have to keep in mind topography and also geology and soils. But the one piece that many people don't think about is the cultural and biological influences. So with the history of Native Americans setting frequent fires throughout North America, and particularly in the Midwest, this really influenced the layout of these different primary plant communities. And the second piece is grazing animals, which we've largely lost or replaced with European type domesticated grazing animals that do not have the same influence or outcomes on these systems. So we all know the story of what's happened to our landscapes since colonization by Euro-Americans. What often gets missed is what has happened with the fire on the landscape. It's really largely been erased. There's mostly fire exclusion, and that it was due to what Deborah talked about, not only prohibition laws, but just the changes in Native American populations due to the introduction of infectious diseases, wars, and then of course the signing of treaties that they were essentially ceding their ancestral lands to the government. And then following that, of course, was the extirpation of these keystone grazing animals, such as bison and elk. So the remaining landscape today, and going forward, it became overgrazed. The Europeans were very attracted to these grassland systems. Large-scale conversion of the natural landscapes for human uses, agriculture, housing, etc. And then we've had a real increase in annual precipitation here in Minnesota, which has largely influenced the mesophication of some of our oak ecosystems. And I'm going to talk more about that through the presentation. And again, talking about all of these factors as how it has increased the invasibility of the natural system. So they've become more susceptible to these non-native invasive plants that have been introduced since Euro-American settlement. So I really like to stay away from the idea of forest succession, because that's an idea that is derived from the fact that humans didn't have any influence on the land historically. And I like to think of that as kind of false. And the whole sort of thread through my presentation is really to highlight that landscapes have always been maintained by humans, and fire was a primary tool in doing so. So this prairie to forest continuum could represent different parts of the country. If you were in the desert Southwest, that prairie would be a cactus forest. And then as you went up higher in altitude, you would also find savanna-like systems, woodlands, and then forest at the top of a mountain. So these fire maintained systems are very, very important and also very diverse. And what gets lost, I think, is that these Native Americans were really significantly influencing the land and all of the plant communities with their regular use of fire. And this is a really interesting read, this book called Forgotten Fires. It goes through each of the regional areas of the country, talks about the historical accounts of early European explorers and settlers, And as Deborah illustrated beautifully, looking at the tree fire ring scars to better understand the frequency of fire that where it was lit in a given area. But this book really does illustrate that most of the continental US was burned with regular frequency. So the idea that at first European contact on the eastern shore of North America, the land was not forested, it was largely open and described as park-like. And this was a landscape that was influenced by fire. And fire frequency, and Deborah talked a little bit about this, it can really influence what the plant community structure looks like. So if you have anywhere from a 2 to 5 year fire interval, that is so frequent that it will limit any woody plants from getting established. So that is going to maintain a grassland system such as a prairie or meadow. When you have a fire frequency from 10 to 20 years, that is enough sort of break time for certain fire tolerant tree species such as oak to become established and develop thick enough bark in order to withstand the next fire that may occur anywhere between 10 and 20 years. So those systems start to turn into savannas and more open woodlands, but they still remain fire adapted. And then when you don't have fire whatsoever, which has really happened in a lot of our spaces since Euro-American settlement, fire suppression, 100+ year fire interval is going to result in a closed canopy forest. And it's also going to have a predominance of species that are fire intolerant. And I'll provide some more examples of that later. This is a map from a 2012 study, and they looked at historical accounts and also the fire scars on trees throughout the country, and they modeled that and created this map which predicts the fire frequency throughout the US pre 1850 settlement. And the bright red areas were fire frequency of anywhere from 2 to 4 years, transitioning into the orange and yellow, so anywhere from maybe 8 to 12 year fire frequency. Greens were anywhere from 18 to maybe 25 year fire frequency. So those would still be maintaining open fire dependent woodlands. And then even into those blue spaces up until a 50-year fire frequency, you'd still be supporting a rather open woodland system. So just those pink and purple sections on this map are really representing spaces that were, or sites that were where there was fire exclusion. And if you look at it, well, that makes sense. A lot of these high altitude areas on mountain ranges, perhaps cool east and north facing slopes that would inherently be places that fire would not have enough fuel in order to run through the system. So the idea that the landscape was all forested pre-settlement is largely false. And Deborah had some really nice examples in addition to what I'm going to mention, but why did Native Americans use fire? Well, they used fire to really maintain these grassland systems because they knew some of the primary mammals that they were hunting were dependent on grasses, including bison and elk. So they also used fire to keep the hunting animals into a certain area, making it easier for them to hunt. They also used fire to get rid of that underbrush and ticks, as Deborah talked about, and it allows them for easier travel through some of these more treed landscapes. It also gave them better sight lines, and that's sort of a primal trait of humans. We like to see enemies coming on the horizon, and so these fire maintained much more open systems. And it also that the Native Americans were really excellent stewards and understood their food needs. And they knew that with fire, it would promote the growth of and in addition, improve the nutritional quality of many of the foods that they foraged, in addition to the mammals such as bison that they may have been hunting. So one great example is blueberries. Blueberries, the ericaceous plants that grow in acidic, fire-adapted pine systems, they produce a much heavier fruit set post-fire in the landscape. So switching back to my home state of Minnesota, this study came out in 2016, and they took another look at those survey records in the bearing trees. And they created this map of our state looking at the prevalence of bearing trees, and also the bearing trees that are the areas that are bright red to yellow to light green would have been largely fire tolerant trees. That bottom southwest part of the state is white because it's prairie, so there weren't any trees growing in that section of the state. But there are some really interesting topographical features that influence those darker green areas, which were where there was pretty much fire was excluded. That large area in the top north part of the state is basically a former glacial lake and now a very large wetland complex. So fire would not be able to travel through that system. And then that really odd sort of dotted line section down in the south central part of the state, which is what we characterize as the big woods, and it's a closed canopy forest. There were significant rivers that were on both the north, western, and southern boundaries of that dotted area that were acting as fire breaks. So there's this oddball area that is not fire dependent simply because of the topographical features. And this study sort of broke it down further into looking at, well, what are these fire tolerant bearing trees, the pyrophilic trees, including deciduous trees such as the oaks, the hickories, hawthorn, and aspen. And then the evergreens species, many different species of pine that are also fire tolerant. And from a plant community standpoint, where I live in Minnesota, those sort of groups of different trees would represent systems such as oak savannas and oak woodlands, in addition to pine barrens. Now, the pyrophobic trees, the trees that are fire intolerant or mesophytic, include the maples, the alders, the birch, hackberry, and so on. And these deciduous trees in upland systems would have created closed canopy forests. And then some of those, such as the cottonwood and perhaps silver maple, would be dominant in a floodplain forest. And then the boreal trees, the evergreen trees that grow in boreal forests, including fir, cedar, spruce, and hemlock. So all fire intolerant trees. And what's really sent me down the rabbit hole lately is understanding better the importance and the rarity of these systems called oak savannas. And this is a map from the Tallgrass Restoration Handbook. The lighter gray area is showing areas of tallgrass prairie. And on that western boundary, of course, the Great Plains of the Midwest would have been shortgrass prairie, where there was less annual precipitation. And then the darker gray areas on that map are where tallgrass savanna and oak woodlands occurred. So you can see that, again, that tension zone in the middle of Minnesota with that dark gray and then the light gray in the prairie on the southwestern edge. But the tallgrass savannas were quite predominant through much of the middle and eastern and parts of the Great Lakes area. And the reason why I'm so interested in them is because they are so rare. So here in Minnesota, we had historically had 18 million acres of prairie. Now we have less than 1% of the original prairie remnants that remain. So that's a 99% decrease in acreage. But if you take a look at how rare these oak savannas are, historically 50 million acres occurred in the Midwest alone, and only 0.06% remain today. Where I live in the tension zone, we still have these large, iconic Bur and white oak trees that are the remnants of this historic plant community. And oak savannas have been, are now globally endangered systems, particularly in temperate parts of North America. So they are so rare that people don't even know what they are or what they look like, because we lack these living examples to show the public. And savannas are not just a Midwestern phenomena. So this, I quickly kind of drew this together last week for this presentation, and I'm missing a lot of other examples of savannas, but I just want to get you thinking about that this is not just a Midwestern fire dependent system. There are California oak savannas, in the Southwest, juniper pinyon savannas. The Southeast is primarily all different types of pine savannas, and Deborah showed some nice examples of pine species in Maryland that are fire dependent. New Jersey pine barrens is a fire dependent system that is characterized as a barrens, which is just another word for savanna. And then you can see in the Northeast, at settlement, or at the first contact, because the Northeast has been inhabited for that much longer than the Midwest, you had predominantly oak and pine systems that were open and park-like and very likely fire-dependent systems. So the fire is really a system, or a tool that has been influencing these systems for thousands of years post-glaciation. And the fire-tolerant trees have developed a number of traits that make them able to withstand fires, but sort of low intensity but frequent fires that run through the ground layer. And their leaf litter, in particular oak leaf litter, dries quickly, it curls, it's very thick, it forms air gaps. So it really creates this nice fuel that carries a fire through a system. The trees themselves have thick bark if they're fire tolerant. So once they reach a certain age of maybe 8 to 10 years old, they will not get killed back to the ground. They're able to withstand the heat of the fire because of their thick bark. But even if they're younger than that, they will burn back to the ground. But they have the ability to close their wounds quickly and then regenerate from the large taproots that they establish, rather than having a superficial root system. And we know how important oaks are thanks to the work of Doug Tallamy in his most recent book, The Nature of Oaks. And Doug has been highlighting the importance of keystone species, which are plant species that really many different organisms depend on within the food web. So they are critical parts of the foundation, or glue, I would call, to glue that network together. And if you take a look at the keystone species plant list that Doug has developed with the National Wildlife Federation, you will note that many of those in the top 10, particularly for the woody plants, are fire-dependent species. And looking at keystone species from a pollinator perspective, many, or the vast majority, I just looked at Minnesota as an example, but approximately 93% of the bee species that are pollen specialists rely on host plants that occur in fire-dependent systems. So for the most part, grasslands, but even on wetland edges that can be considered sometimes fire excluded, but also fire dependent. So these systems are much more functional because they're supporting a much higher diversity of species, including more keystone plant species. So if we want to sort of superficially define what these four things or plant communities within this prairie to forest continuum, we can think of prairies as it's a pretty easy plant community to describe. It is a grassland system. It has herbaceous ground cover comprised of grasses and sedges and flowering plants. It may have one tree per acre, but very, very few trees would occur in a prairie or meadow to consider calling it a prairie or meadow. Savanna, you start to get scattered populations of trees, sometimes groupings of trees, or sometimes single trees out in the landscape. And these would be tree species that are fire tolerant, including oak, some types of hickories, and of course pine. But you're still maintaining that very diverse prairie-like ground layer vegetation, which really helps to boost overall plant diversity. So not only do you have all the species that would occur in a prairie, but you may have some more woodland species that are thriving underneath the shade of some of those scattered populations of trees. And then when the tree cover gets a little more dense, anywhere from 50 to 70%, it's still considered a woodland. There's still patches of sunlight that are successfully reaching the forest, the woodland floor. It's still predominantly made up of fire tolerant trees because it's a fire tolerant system. And that may include, of course, oak, hickory, aspen, some of the smaller thicket-like plants such as hawthorn and plum. And then a forest is really anywhere from 70 to 100% canopy cover. So you're getting into more diverse number of tree species, but very, very shaded environment and very low herbaceous ground layer vegetation. And that's really what this spectrum is showing. So tree species diversities obviously increases from a prairie to a forest system. And in addition, so does tree canopy cover. But the reason I have that asterisk on the high on that bottom right in a forest is because these forests, if you're talking from a successional standpoint, when they reach this climax state, they tend to become very low in tree diversity. You have one or a handful of species that are dominating. This is an image of our big woods that I mentioned earlier, our closed canopy forest plant community. And it's dominated by sugar maple and maybe some American basswood. So what is going to happen if a sugar maple tree dies in this system? There are many sugar maple seedlings ready to take over. So they actually become less functional and very low in diversity when they reach this climax state. And looking at this from how do we really support more biodiversity and keep these systems functional? Well, we know that high plant diversity will yield high insect diversity, which really is forming the robust foundation of complex food webs. So with savanna and grassland systems, you're really sort of peaking at pollinator diversity as well as herbaceous diversity. So these are a noble system to be as a target for some types of ecological restorations. And again, these are more functional systems. So again, I like to get away from talking about forest succession. Savannas are a stable system, but they need human intervention and human stewardship. And they will succeed into a forest without that. But if we apply the right ecological restoration tools, such as fire and grazing, this system is a stable and functional system. Now, let's talk about carbon sequestration of all these sort of types of systems. And this is where we're thinking as ecological practitioners, how can we best plan for the future in the landscapes that we are planting and designing today? And when you look at carbon storage from the tons of carbon per hectare, this is a graphic from the IPCC. The visual capitalists made it into this sort of more pretty graphic that I'm borrowing from. But it really looks at basically the different systems throughout the world and their capacity to store carbon. So I'm highlighting the systems that are most appropriate for the people tuning into the presentation today. So including boreal forests, temperate grasslands, and wetlands. And switching back quickly to my home state of Minnesota, our Center for Forest Ecology at the University of Minnesota, they've done some pretty interesting modeling of the future trends of our state and how we are going to trend likely hotter and drier rather than hotter and wetter. And so this is the scenario with a +8 degrees Celsius warming. You can see the red area is prairie, so that prairie is pushing from the west and southwest into basically the more than half of our state. So it's going to become a grassland dominated system. The light yellow is that transition zone. This scenario pushes the boreal forest that currently occurs on the north side of Lake Superior out of the state and into Canada. And then where broadleaf forest may persist is on that northern shore. And if we look at a 10 degree+ centigrade warming model, which is really where we're tracking right now, because we're not doing a very good job of mitigating the impacts of climate change, then our state really becomes predominantly prairie and hot and dry in a grassland system, again, sort of representing parts of Kansas. The last places that we will have a broadleaf forest will be on that upper eastern tip on the north side of Lake Superior. But this is the model I am looking at. I'm looking at sort of the worst case scenario when I'm thinking about how do we make these systems that we are restoring the most resilient for this climate change. So boreal forests, if we go back to the carbon sequestration capacity of these systems, that's out of the equation if I'm looking at it from the standpoint of Minnesota, and that's very likely from the state that you live in as well. And that really narrows it down to temperate forests, temperate grasslands, and wetlands. I'm not going to talk about wetlands, but because I'm focusing on upland habitat restoration, but looking at those two systems, the temperate forests and temperate grasslands, the really key thing on this illustration is where that carbon is being sequestered. So 153 tons of carbon per hectare annually stored in temperate forests, and 243 tons of carbon in fire-dependent grassland systems. But the big picture here is where that carbon is getting stored. And in forest, it's primarily in above ground vegetation, the woody plant material of trees and understory shrubs is storing that carbon. But that carbon storage is short-term storage, because when a tree dies in a forest, that carbon gets re-released back into the atmosphere. Whereas in grassland systems, most of that carbon is getting stored below ground in the soil, and ideally deep in the soil profile, where it will remain indefinitely as long as that soil is not disturbed. So these temperate grassland systems are much better at carbon sequestration than forests. And that begs the question, should we be planting trees everywhere for climate change in order to sequester carbon? And I would argue where grassland systems are appropriate, we should really be thinking about restoring land to grassland systems rather than keeping them in a sort of a primitive, low diversity, sort of not very functional system of a forest. And we've all seen various illustrations such as this. This is one by Janet Wissink. She prepared for Wild Ones. It's not really to scale, but most of you already know about the extensive root systems of both grassland and forward plants that occur in grassland systems. And the carbon sequestration is happening really with the dying off of about 1/3 of those root systems per year. And then that plant material is being deposited or kept within the soil profile. And that is how one way that these grassland systems are depositing carbon in the soil. And sometimes these grassland plants can have extensive root systems. And as Deborah pointed out, with natural disturbances such as fire or grazing, it will stimulate a lot more new root system growth that is, again, depositing more carbon into the soil. And then, of course, the really amazing process called photosynthesis, where the plants are capturing energy from the sun. And they are basically pushing a lot of excess carbohydrates and sugars into the soil that they don't need. And that in turn is feeding biological things such as fungi and bacteria in the soil, the mycorrhizal fungi. We now know how important it is to help facilitate the nutrients and transfer nutrients from the soil to plants. So it's actually helping to feed this system that is really critical in order for plants to grow and for plants to thrive. And this is really important too if we are going to restore some of these more grassland systems. We have to keep in mind that tilling and chemical inputs and large-scale soil disturbance is really just going to re-release this carbon sink that we are creating. So I want to focus the rest of the presentation on sort of what I have learned over time about why our efforts, early efforts to try and remove invasive plants and restore systems was not working. And we weren't thinking of this from the standpoint that these systems were fire dependent, and that what has happened since fire exclusion. And for a lot of the landscapes where I live in that tension zone, we're at the tipping point from an ecological landscape management standpoint. And this tipping point is also called mesophication. And this was a term coined by Abrams and Nowacki in their seminal paper in 2008. They called it the demise of fire and mesophication of forests in the eastern US. And this graphic really shows what I've talked about earlier. You remove fire from the system, and what happens over time, 100, 200 years, is that these fire intolerant trees start to invade the system. And as they invade the system, the shading, cool conditions really erase any sort of grassland or diverse herbaceous ground layer vegetation. And then it becomes this sort of self or positive feedback loop where it's now a more moist and shaded condition, which facilitates the growth and reintroduction of more mesophytic trees. And at this point, which is where many of the oak-dominated fire-dependent landscapes in where I live here in Minnesota, this is where we're at. And this is the system and point in time that invasive species, including European buckthorn, which is our primary invasive plant in invading woodland fire-dependent systems, garlic mustard, and then we are part of the glaciated part of North America. So any earthworms that occur here are non-native, and they are also wreaking havoc on the system. So this is also from Greg Nowacki's study, and I just want you to take a look at the top left graphic to start with. So what he's showing here is with fire, there's some troughs. So that ball rolls back and forth between being an oak savanna, oak woodland, or oak forest. And that is a stable system because fire is being used at various frequencies to roll that ball back and forth depending on how frequent the fire is applied. Now the upper right image, the left side is mesic, so more moist sort of situations, and the two right columns are xeric or very dry situations. And drier systems are even more stable and less susceptible to the encroachment of fire intolerant trees simply because of the conditions. They don't thrive in really dry conditions. So it's much easier to keep a dry site stable with the addition of fire. So taking a look at the bottom graphics, we are at the tipping point here in a lot of our systems. So we've had fire exclusion, those systems become unstable. And then as Greg Nowacki sort of coined the term, the ball drops down into the abyss. So if you are Sisyphus, which I think I felt like I've been Sisyphus for the first 10 years doing landscape restoration, we're trying to push this ball up a cliff that we can't get that ball over the top and back into a stable system because we haven't been applying the critical tool, which is fire. And they were just keep that positive or self-reinforcing loop just keeps traveling. That train keeps traveling down the tracks, and the system becomes more and more unstable, even if we try and for example, take out the invasive plants from the system. So here is a picture of a typical landscape. This was formerly an oak savanna. You can still see large structured oak trees. That dark green plant that's dominating the understory is the European buckthorn. So this is an oak system that over time has had encroachment by fire intolerant trees, which has created more moist conditions. It has changed the system. The system has become unstable, and that really is just put out the welcome mat for these invasive species that have been introduced by Europeans. And so taking another look at an example, my orange markers here are marking oaks in what was once an open oak fire dependent system. And these oak trees are anywhere from 100 to 150 years old. They're slow growing. And that's one thing to keep in mind. These mesophytic fire intolerant trees tend to grow faster. And if you look at what's happening here, the blue markers are now marking the fire intolerant trees, in this case, American basswood for the most part in this picture. And now oaks have no less light. They don't have the ability to regenerate. If an acorn falls on the ground, it simply doesn't have enough nutrients and light in order to germinate. So we have no oak establishment or regeneration once the system becomes unstable. And you can see the dark green plant, that's European buckthorn. And here's an example of where the management that has been applied to this system is simply to look at, I need to remove the invasive plants. And so the buckthorn has been cut once, and now it's starting to regrow, but you're not changing the systemic change in the conditions in order for it to become more stable again. So what is needed here is actually the harvesting, in addition to invasive plant removal, is the harvesting of the fire intolerant trees. I also want to mention that some of the other traits that mesophytic trees have to sort of keep the system more moist, and even though it may not be completely closed canopy. So we know that the understory is cooler because of those closed canopy conditions. We know that closed canopy forests are moister because they suppress fire. That light reduction also prevents a lot of evaporation, so the soil layer remains moister. And this really results in, again, low herbaceous diversity. Heather Alexander and colleagues published a study in 2021, and they looked at stem flow, which is not a new thing. Foresters have talked about stem flow for a long time, but she looked at how does stem flow influence the creation of this moist microhabitat. And this is when, like the picture I just showed before, when these mesophytic trees start to invade fire dependent systems. And so many mesophytic trees like maples, beech, gums, as Deborah mentioned, for you, those of you in the East Coast, they have smooth bark. And so with rainfall, that water flows down the smooth bark. It doesn't get captured into a rough furrow bark that you would think of an oak tree. And it basically creates this moist microhabitat around the ground of the tree. So even if there's been encroachment of fire intolerant trees into a fire intolerant system, you try and run a fire through there, and the tree is creating these conditions to help prevent it from getting killed by creating this moist microhabitat. And the leaf litter, Deborah also talked about this, but oak leaves and fire tolerant trees tend to have thicker leaves. They hold on to the tree longer. They dry and curl quickly, forming these nice air gaps, whereas maple and other mesophytic tree leaf litter tends to be thinner. It's flat, it holds moisture, it mats to the ground, it doesn't have many air pockets. So it's not a good facilitator of carrying a fire through a system. And here in Minnesota, where we have invasive earthworms just devour mesophytic leaf litter first, and then switch over to the less palatable oak leaves later. So they're really creating bare soil conditions in these closed canopy forests, removing that insulating layer for the few herbaceous species that still are trying to exist in that system, and resulting in even lower diversity. So what can we do? Well, we need to sort of look at these landscapes through a different lens, whether you want to reintroduce fire, and the composition of these forests or woodlands, and maybe look at it from the standpoint of what is not quite right about this system, and is this structure and composition really influencing invasive species encroachment. So we want to get away from promoting these cool, moist, shaded conditions, which will, if you have an oak ecosystem, and oaks are extremely important as a keystone species, we don't want to do things that lead to the further decline of these keystone species. And with the warming climate, even if you're trending warmer and moister, looking at these keystone species that are fire dependent, that are going to survive in the new normal where you live. So here I'm on a mission to preserve, restore, and reconstruct grasslands and fire dependent systems, because that seems like an appropriate model given our climate change modeling. We want to arrest that mesophication process if we're on the ground practitioners, thinking about harvesting some of those mesophytic trees, reestablishing fire into the system, removing invasive plants. That's just one step. If we just do that, again, we're not going to change the systemic problems, and revegetating with that to reestablish that herbaceous ground layer vegetation. As Julie mentioned, one of my most recent projects is through a friend's nonprofit board that I serve on. This is a property, that 32-acre property my municipality recently acquired. We formed the Friends group to help write grants and start the process of restoring the site. This is a 250-year-old white oak tree, and you can see this is what mature buckthorn looks like. It gets extremely big, 20-25 feet tall, and that oak tree is essentially suffocating from years of lack of land stewardship and encroachment by mesophytic trees, in addition to invasive species. So the grants, we wrote a couple of grants, our Friends group, and were awarded about $90,000. And this is one of the really cool tools that we're using here in the Midwest to return some of these degraded systems to more fire dependent and open systems. So this is actually a forestry timber harvesting machine called a feller buncher. It's got a large spinning carbide blade on the front and grapples. And the drivers are so skilled. They are truly restoration people, not just someone driving a big machine. They understand and can identify different tree species. And they work through the landscape on frozen ground in the winter, and through precision surgery, cut out all of the invasive plants, in addition to harvesting some of those mesophytic trees. So we embarked on this starting last year, or I guess 12 months ago was when this harvesting happened. And then this was a drone shot view post-harvesting. You can see the iconic oak trees that we have left in the system. This spring, we were hoping for a fire, because we wanted a low intensity fire to carry through the system, or excuse me, last fall. But we had a severe drought, which limited our burn window. So our burn will happen this spring. And burning will help sort of burn off some of the seedlings of the invasive plants. This is what it looked like midsummer. So we got a really nice response in sedge and ground layer species. We have established 17 different permanent vegetation plots to track the change in vegetation composition and diversity over time. We have conducted pre and post bird surveys. Likely be initiating some pollinator surveys here. So next steps are burning this spring, And then we take advantage of that temporarily burnt ground to broadcast both prairie and savanna seed mixes across the landscape. So with the long-term goal of revegetating this system, reestablishing the ground layer herbaceous vegetation, and that in turn will help carry and fuel future fires that we will have with regular frequency. So as my message as ecological land stewards is this: I think we need to start communicating the profound influence that Native Americans and First Nations people had, and the role of land stewardship. There's no longer this idea of pristine wilderness that humans never went into. Land has always been stewarded by people, and very thoughtfully. And thank you to ELA for having speakers from the Native American community. I think it's an excellent example of how we need to prioritize forging more partnerships to better understand both the historical and current land stewardship knowledge and practices. And then we also need to find opportunities such as this and in our conversations to initiate inclusion, understanding, and reconciliation. So I'm going to leave you with two quotes. The one on the left is from the Southeastern Grassland Initiative. Dwayne Estes is heading up that, restoring grassland systems in the Southeast. And the other is from a Midwestern restoration ecologist that specializes in savanna restoration. And I'll read the myth.
Yeah, Heather, do you want to go ahead and read them?
Yeah, I'll read the myth of the forest first. So the current wooded state of many abandoned lands creates an impression of forest, but the forest perception is dangerously incorrect and has facilitated a century of mismanagement. And Dwayne Estes and colleagues say, this is from the Southeast, our society is in love with forests, but our desire to have a forested landscape is killing our native diversity, and we have been in ecological collapse for decades. There are thousands of acres locked up in state forests, state parks, wildlife management areas, nature preserves, and national parks that are silently trying to tell us that they are suffering. So thank you so much. Julie, I'll jump out of my slide here.
Okay.
Hopefully we didn't go over time, but I will also be available in the garden room. So.
Excellent. Thank you, Heather. That was amazing. What a case for systems thinking. I just kept thinking, I just really appreciated how you laid it out and you focused so much on the history and the land management approaches and looking at it from such a holistic view and bringing people back into the system, you know, counting that as a valid piece that was really wonderful. We do have some questions. We are kind of pushing the limit on time. I just want to ask quickly, someone wanted to know about your modeling. What tools do you use to model your ecoregion to project the future climate change? Maybe you could answer that quickly.
Yeah, that was based on our Center for Forest Ecology modeling. So I'm really just tracking what, you know, our local ecological universities are saying, and with that, then I'm extrapolating, okay, what does that mean from a plant community level? And really, we're on this trend of hotter and drier here where I live. So it makes sense to look south and west from where I currently live. But yeah, I'm relying on other experts to sort of keep up with those modeling trends. Okay.
So we do have a number of other questions, but what I'd like to do is let's all move into the speaker garden at that time, and then we'll list the questions there so they're captured and they'll be there for you, Heather.
Great.
But thank you again so much. That was really wonderful.